Washington, D.C. The spring of 1893. Inside the highest courtroom in America, 9 justices of the Supreme Court are settling into their seats. This is the bench that rules on wars, on the Constitution, on the fate of the nation itself. And on this particular day, the 9 most powerful judges in the country are here to answer one question. Is a tomato a fruit? Or is it a vegetable? Nobody is joking. Lawyers stand before the bench and read aloud from dictionaries. The definition of fruit, the definition of vegetable, the definition of cucumber, of squash, of pea, entered into the official record of the United States Supreme Court. One entry at a time. Real money is riding on the answer. Thousands of dollars. An entire importing business. And a federal tax collected at the docks of New York. The ruling they hand down will still be standing law more than a century later. One of the strangest decisions in American history, and judges still bring it up today. Here is what those 9 justices did not know. They were only the latest people to lose sleep over this question. For 350 years before that morning, the tomato had been called a poison, a medicina, a temptation, a decoration, and a peasant food that respectable people would not touch. Now it was a federal case. The road to that courtroom is longer and stranger than anyone on the bench ever imagined. It starts on the other side of the world from Italy, thousands of years before Italy had ever heard the word tomato. And before this fruit could be taxed, feared, canned, bottled, or put on a pizza. Somebody had to invent it, travel back thousands of years, to the western edge of South America, where the Andes Mountains slide down toward the Pacific coast. Growing wild on those slopes are the tomato's oldest relatives. Tough little plants with berries about the size of a blueberry. Small, red, and easy to walk right past. You could hold 50 of them in one hand. If one showed up in your salad today, you would assume it fell off somebody's keychain. Those little berries are the ancestral line behind every tomato on earth. Every heirloom at the farmer's market, every beefsteak on a burger, every cherry tomato in a lunchbox traces back to that wild family. And the distance between a berry you could lose in your pocket and the fist-sized tomato in your kitchen is a distance nature never crossed on its own. People carried it there. The journey ran north, out of South America and up into Mesoamerica, the region that today includes Mexico and Central America. Along that long road, generation after generation of indigenous farmers did something remarkable. They looked at this plant and saw what it could become. Season after season, they saved seeds from the fruits worth keeping. The bigger ones, the meatier ones, the ones that tasted best. And they planted those. Then their children did it again. Their grandchildren did it again. Across centuries of patient selection, down paths that scientists are still piecing together, the berry grew larger, fleshier, more varied, ridged ones, smooth ones, fruits in shades of yellow and orange and red. Long before any European ship touched American shores, human hands had already redesigned this plant from the ground up. The tomato was not discovered. The tomato was built. By the time it reached the great farming cultures of Mesoamerica, it had earned a permanent place at the table. Speakers of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec world, knew this family of plants as tomatal. And the plump red one, the ancestor of the fruit in your kitchen, they called sitomatl. Squeeze those syllables together across 5 centuries and listen to what falls out. Tomatl, tomato. Every time anyone, anywhere on this planet orders a tomato, they are speaking a fossil of that language, whether they know it or not. And this fruit was no bystander in that world. It lived inside a complete cuisine, one of the most sophisticated food systems on Earth at the time. Corn, beans, squash, chili peppers. Cooks in Mesoamerican markets were grinding tomatoes with chilies into table sauces centuries before anyone in Europe had ever tasted anything like salsa. The tomato had recipes. It had companions. It had a job. Ask anyone in those markets what this fruit was for, and they could tell you without thinking twice. Then, in the early 1500s, Spanish ships arrived. The men aboard those ships would later be credited in European books with discovering the tomato. Look closely at what actually happened, and the word discovery falls apart. The Spanish walked into markets and found a fully finished crop, shaped by centuries of expert breeding, woven into a cuisine older than most European kingdoms, carrying a name it had held for generations. They did not find a wild curiosity. They found somebody else's masterpiece. What the Spanish did was uproot it. Seeds crossed the Atlantic in the holds of returning ships, bound for a continent that had no idea what was coming. And here is the detail that would shape the next 200 years. The seeds made the voyage. The knowledge did not. The recipes, the growing wisdom, the everyday certainty of what this fruit was for, all of it stayed behind in the Americas. Europe was about to receive one of the great foods of the world, with the instruction manual ripped out. Italy. The year 1544. A physician and naturalist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli is examining a strange new plant that has been turning up in Italian gardens. And he writes it into the scientific record. The fruit is flattened, ribbed like a tiny pumpkin, and it ripens from green to gold. Italians begin calling it pomodoro, the golden apple. And tucked into his notes sits a detail that most versions of this story leave out. Mattioli reported that some people were already eating the thing, cooked like an eggplant. He wrote, fried in oil, with salt and pepper. So within a few decades of landing in Europe, the tomato was already on somebody's plate in Italy. And it had a foothold in Spanish kitchens too, simmering in market town stews while the rest of the continent squinted at it from a safe distance. That is the real puzzle of the tomato's first European century. One fruit, one continent, two completely different verdicts. In parts of Spain and southern Italy, it was dinner. North of the Alps, it spent generations as a suspect, grown as a curiosity, painted by artists, catalogued by botanists, and kept far away from the table. Why would half a continent eat something the other half was afraid of? Part of the answer came down to family. When European botanists traced the tomato's relatives, things took a dark turn. This plant belongs to the nightshades. In the Americas, that meant nothing. In Europe, the nightshades were infamous. This was the family of deadly nightshade, whose berries could kill a child. The family of mandrake and henbane, plants tangled up in centuries of witchcraft lore and poisoners' tales. Now a stranger shows up claiming membership in that family, with lush leaves that give off a sharp, bitter smell when you brush against them. 16th century Europe judged the newcomer by its relatives, and its relatives had a criminal record. Respected voices piled on. In England, the herbalist John Gerard wrote the whole plant off as rank and stinking, fine to look at, foolish to eat. Doctors of the era, trained to sort foods by their supposed effects on the body, filed the tomato under cold and moist, a category that carried real suspicion in the medicine of the day. In the gardens of the north, the golden apple stayed exactly that, an ornament, admired and untouched. Now, You may have heard a much more dramatic explanation for all this fear. The famous version goes like this. European aristocrats ate off pewter plates. Pewter contained lead. The acid in tomatoes pulled that lead out of the plates. The lead poisoned the wealthy diners. And the innocent tomato took the blame. Condemned across Europe as the poison apple. It is a tidy story. It gets repeated in articles and videos everywhere. And it has one problem. Historians who went digging for actual evidence. Sick aristocrats. Period accounts. Anything written at the time blaming tomatoes served on pewter came back nearly empty-handed. There is no solid trail. The poison plate story is a modern legend wearing a history costume. The truth is quieter and, honestly, more interesting. The tomato's real obstacle in Europe was never a chemical. It was a blank space where the knowledge should have been. Think about what a new food actually needs before anyone will eat it. Knowing that something is edible gets you almost nowhere. Somebody has to show you how it fits into your life. Do you eat this raw or cooked? Does it go with bread? With meat? With oil? Is it for the rich or the poor? For feast days or for Tuesdays? Is it food at all? Or is it medicine? Or just a pretty plant for the garden wall? Every food you eat without thinking comes wrapped in generations of invisible answers to those questions. The tomato landed in Europe naked. No habits. No tradition. No grandmother's recipe. Wherever somebody filled in those answers, the tomato became food. Wherever nobody did, it stayed a decoration with a suspicious family, sitting in the garden for 200 years. Which explains the map. Spain had a head start on the answers, because Spain was plugged directly into the Americas, where the tomato already had a job. Southern Italy sat inside the Spanish world, trading goods, recipes, and habits across the Mediterranean. The knowledge that had been left behind on the docks was slowly leaking back, one kitchen at a time. And one city was about to take those borrowed answers and build something the world had never tasted. It was crowded. It was loud. It was poor. And it was hungry. It was Naples. Come down out of the palaces and the botanical gardens and step into a different world. A cramped kitchen near the Bay of Naples. Sometime in the 1600s, charcoal smoke hangs in the air. A battered pan sits over the fire, and in that pan, olive oil is starting to shimmer. A handful of garlic goes in. Then, somebody takes a ripe tomato, crushes it in one fist, and drops it into the hot oil. The pan hisses. Steam rolls up. Red spreads across the metal, and the room fills with a smell no European kitchen had ever produced before. In ordinary moments like this one, in poor kitchens no historian ever bothered to record. The future of Western food quietly changed direction. Why here? Why did southern Italy embrace the fruit that so much of Europe kept at arm's length? Start with the land itself. The climate around Naples is hot, dry, and drenched in sun. Far closer to the tomato's American homeland than the grey gardens of England could ever be. Plant a tomato in that volcanic soil at the foot of Mount Vesuvius, and it does not merely survive, it explodes. Vines sag under the weight of fruit through a growing season that seems to go on forever. Then, look at the people. Naples in the 1600s was one of the largest, most crowded, and poorest cities in Europe. For the working families packed into its alleys, food came down to brutal arithmetic. Grain, olive oil, vegetables, whatever the land gave cheap and plenty. Suspicion of a productive food plant was a luxury for people with full pantries. When a vine grows like a weed, fruits for months, and costs almost nothing, A hungry city does not consult the botanists. It gets out a pan. The paper trail catches up with the cooking in 1692. That year, in Naples, a professional chef named Antonio Latini published a cookbook, and inside it sits one of the earliest known tomato recipes in Europe. Roast the tomatoes over coals. He tells the reader, peel them. Chop them fine with onion and chili and a splash of vinegar. Anyone who has ever eaten Mexican food will recognize what that is. It is salsa. And Latini, writing in Italy, gave the recipe a name that says everything. He called it Spanish-style sauce. That one label quietly demolishes a beloved myth. The dish that would become the soul of Italian cooking did not spring from Italian genius in a single flash of invention. The recipe echoes Spain. And through Spain, it echoes the markets of Mesoamerica, where cooks had been grinding tomatoes with chilies for centuries. The most Italian flavor in the world began as a borrowed idea, passed hand to hand across an empire, reworked in thousands of anonymous kitchens until Naples made it its own. Latini's recipe was a starting gun, and the race ran long. Over the following century and beyond, the experiment slowly hardened into a cuisine. Fire revealed what the display cases never could. Cook a tomato down and everything concentrates. The sweetness deepens. The acid brightens. The color turns a rich, glowing red. The tomato melted into olive oil and carried garlic and basil like it had been designed for them. Above all, it clung to starch. First bread, and then, by the 1800s, the cheap dried pasta that fed the Neapolitan poor for ages. Ordinary southern Italians had eaten their pasta pale, seasoned with little more than cheese or oil. The tomato gave that daily survival food a sauce, and the two locked together so completely that the world would forget they had ever been separate. Around Vesuvius, farmers began selecting vines whose fruit was born for the pot. Dense, low in seeds, easy to peel. The ancestors of the legendary San Marzano tomatoes that sauce lovers still argue about today. Families built late summer rituals around the harvest, cooking and bottling the red so it would last through winter. And down in the streets, bakers slid flat rounds of dough into wood-fired ovens and topped them with the cheapest good thing in the city: crushed tomatoes. Dock workers ate it folded in their hands. Fast, hot, and practically free. The rest of the world would need another 2 centuries to learn the word for it. Pizza. Step back and look at what happened here, because it is genuinely strange. This fruit arrived a complete outsider, a botanical suspect with no history on the continent and no place at any table. Within a few generations around the Bay of Naples, all of that was forgotten. Grandmothers passed tomato recipes to granddaughters, as if the family had cooked this way since Rome. The sauce became shorthand for home, for the South, for Italy itself. The stranger had not simply been accepted. The stranger had become the family. Then history played its cruelest trick on the very people who made that happen. In the late 1800s, southern Italy fell into crisis. Crops failed. Taxes crushed the poor, and work disappeared. Families around Naples faced a choice their ancestors never imagined: stay and starve, or leave everything and start over across the ocean. Millions chose the ships. They packed almost nothing, because they had almost nothing. But folded into that almost nothing went seeds, bottled sauce, and recipes carried in memory. The tomato was boarding a boat, headed back toward the hemisphere where its story began, to a country that had no idea it was about to fall in love: New York Harbor. The late 1800s Steamships ease past the new Statue of Liberty, decks crowded with families from southern Italy. Between 1880 and the early 1900s, some 4 million Italians came to America, most from the poor South, and they arrived carrying the food of home, in trunks and bundles, in jars of sauce and packets of seeds, and above all, in the muscle memory of the women who cooked. The tomato sailed into New York. Almost nobody on those docks knew enough history to appreciate the joke. This fruit was born in the Americas. Its ancestors grew wild on American mountainsides, and American farmers spent centuries perfecting it before Europe even knew it existed. Now it was crossing back over the Atlantic in the luggage of European immigrants, returning to the hemisphere where its story began. And the country receiving it would treat it as exotic foreign food, 300 years out. And nobody recognized it at the door. To be fair, Americans had met the tomato before. It grew in colonial gardens, and Thomas Jefferson raised tomatoes at Monticello. Through the 1800s, it crept into American cookbooks, eaten by some, side-eyed by others, trailed by the same old nightshade rumors it had dragged around Europe. The tomato existed in America. What it lacked was a starring role. The immigrants changed that. Spaghetti with red sauce jumped from immigrant kitchens to lunch counters and church cookbooks, mutating as it traveled. Sweeter here, heavier there, draped over meatballs in a combination Naples never imagined. Pizza followed a little later. From Neapolitan bakeries in Lower Manhattan to a national obsession, dishes born poor in the alleys of Naples were becoming, plate by plate, simply American food. Then American industry took over. Because the United States, at the turn of the century, did what it always did with food it loved. It scaled it. Start with the can. The tomato's oldest enemy was the calendar, a flood of fruit in August. Nothing by November. Canning killed that problem. Sealed in tin, tomatoes could last for years and travel anywhere. And American factories ran the trick at a size the world had never seen. By the early 1900s, canned tomatoes and tomato soup sat in pantries from coast to coast. Summer in a can, available in January, in Minnesota, for pocket change. And then there is the strangest chapter of the whole American romance. The bottle of ketchup. The word ketchup did not start with tomatoes at all. It traces back to Asia, to fermented fish sauces that English traders carried home. And for generations, ketchup meant sauces made from mushrooms or walnuts or oysters. The tomato version showed up in American kitchens in the early 1800s. And one of the first published recipes came from a Philadelphia physician named James Mees in 1812. Homemade tomato ketchup was a gamble, though it spoiled fast, and quality swung wildly from batch to batch. An Ohio businessman named Henry Hines solved it. Ripe red tomatoes, heavy doses of vinegar and sugar, clean factories, and a clear glass bottle so customers could see exactly what they were buying. At a time when food fraud was everywhere, the formula nailed a flavor Americans could not resist. Sweet, sour, salty, and deeply savory all at once. By the early 1900s, Heinz was selling millions of bottles a year. And that particular taste, tomato, sugar, vinegar, came about as close as anything ever has to being the national flavor of the United States. So picture the tomato's American empire by the early 1890s. Red fields from New Jersey to California, canneries running day and night, soup can, ketchup bottles, sauce pots, backyard gardens. The suspect years were ancient history. The tomato had gone from outsider to industry, And in America, the moment something becomes an industry, two things show up right behind it: money and the law. In 1883, Congress passed a new tariff act, a wall of taxes meant to protect American farmers from foreign competition. Buried in its pages sat one line with consequences nobody saw coming. Imported vegetables would pay a duty of 10%. Imported fruit came in free. Down at the docks of New York worked a produce importing family, John Nix and his sons, running one of the biggest firms in the city, bringing in tomatoes from the Caribbean in the cold months when American fields stood empty. Every shipment. The customs collector of the Port of New York, a man named Edward Hedden, held out his hand for the vegetable tax. 10%. Cargo after cargo. Year after year. For the Nix family, the loophole was sitting in plain sight. Ask any scientist, and the answer is unambiguous. A tomato develops from the flower of the plant and carries its seeds. Botanically speaking, a tomato is a fruit. Full stop. And fruit, said the law, comes in free. So, in 1887, the Nix family did something almost perfectly American. They sued the taxman. They demanded their money back. Every dollar collected on the theory that a tomato is a vegetable. And their case began climbing through the federal courts. Up and up, until the question landed in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. 350 years of confusion. From the gardens of the Renaissance to the kitchens of Naples to the docks of New York, had been boiled down to a single legal question. What, in the eyes of the law, is a tomato? 9 justices were about to give America their answer. Back to Washington. Back to that courtroom in the spring of 1893. Only now you know what the 9 justices are really holding in their hands. This is the newest round of an argument that has been running since the first Spanish ship carried seeds across the Atlantic. A physician in Renaissance Italy called this thing a golden apple. An English herbalist called it rank and stinking. A Neapolitan chef called it Spanish-style sauce. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has to call it something. And this time the answer comes with a price tag. The case is titled Nix versus Hedden, the importer against the tax collector. And the scene inside that courtroom plays out like nothing else in the court's history. The lawyers for the Nix family stand up and read into the record the dictionary definitions of the word fruit and the word tomato. The government's lawyer answers by reading the definitions of pea, eggplant, cucumber, squash, and pepper. The Nix side fires back with potato, turnip, parsnip, cauliflower, cabbage, carrot, and bean. Picture the room for a moment. The most powerful court on earth. The bench that decides wars and constitutions. Sitting in respectful silence while grown men in formal suits read the dictionary at each other. Vegetable by vegetable. Entry by entry. On paper. The Nix family had a bulletproof case. Science does not stutter on this question. A tomato grows from the flower of the plant. It wraps around the seeds. Every botanist alive would testify the same way. The tomato is a fruit. The law taxes vegetables. So the tomato enters free and the taxman owes a refund. On May 10th, 1893, the court handed down its answer. And it was unanimous. The tomato lost. Justice Horace Gray wrote the opinion. And his reasoning is the part worth remembering. Botanically speaking, he admitted, tomatoes are the fruit of a vine. And so are cucumbers, squashes, beans, and peas. But when Congress wrote the word vegetables into the tariff, Congress was speaking the common language of the people. and in the common language of the people. Tomatoes grow in vegetable gardens. They are served at dinner in, with, or after the soup. Alongside the potatoes and the carrots, in the main part of the meal, nobody sets a tomato on the table for dessert. So, under the law of the United States, the tomato is a vegetable. The tax stands. The Nix family loses its money. Notice what the court actually did there. Because it is easy to get wrong, the justices never rejected the science. They agreed with every word of it. They simply ruled that botany was not the language Congress had been speaking when it wrote the law. Laws are written for dinner tables, for grocery stores, for the docks of New York. And at every one of those places, a tomato was a vegetable. So a vegetable it was. 9-0. Without meaning to. The court had written the closing argument for this entire 350-year story. The tomato's identity was never decided by nature. It was decided, over and over, by whoever happened to be holding it. Nahuatl farmers held it, and it was zitamatl, a food with a job. Renaissance collectors held it, and it was a golden ornament. Northern herbalists held it, and it was a suspect. Naples held it, and it became sauce. Then dinner. Then home itself. America held it, and it became a soup can. A red bottle. An industry. And when the argument finally reached the highest bench in the land, the justices ruled the same way every kitchen already had. A tomato is whatever your table says it is. The verdict never went away. Nix versus Hedden is still standing law, still cited by American judges as a classic example of courts reading words the way ordinary people use them instead of the way textbooks define them. And America never really stopped arguing the case for fun. New Jersey made the tomato its official state vegetable. Arkansas, refusing to choose, declared it both the state fruit and the state vegetable in the same breath. More than a century after 9 justices settled the matter unanimously, the country still cannot leave it alone. As for the tomato itself, the verdict changed nothing, and the century that followed changed everything. It now stands among the most widely grown and eaten crops on the planet. Hundreds of millions of tons a year. From greenhouse vines in Holland to sauce fields in China to that perfectly round, perfectly red supermarket tomato, bred tough enough to survive a truck ride in January. Gardeners hunt down old heirloom seeds, chasing flavors the industry left behind. Every one of them, the lumpy heirloom and the hothouse ball alike, descends from a small wild berry on a South American mountainside that got passed from hand to hand until the whole world claimed it. Somewhere tonight, a kid in New Jersey will squeeze ketchup over fries. A grandmother in Naples will stir a pot of sauce her own grandmother taught her. Neither of them will think of it as foreign food. Because it is not. It stopped being foreign the moment each of their tables made room for it. Case closed. So now the bench is yours. The court ruled vegetable. Botany says fruit. Your kitchen gets the final vote. Drop your verdict in the comments. And if this story changed the way you look at a bottle of ketchup, hit subscribe and like this video so more people can find it. Court is adjourned.